I never thought betrayal would come wearing the face I kissed goodnight for more than a decade. My name is Mark Reynolds. I am 42 years old, born and raised in Eugene, Oregon, and these days I work in financial compliance out of Seattle. But this story begins in Portland, back when I believed my life was solid, my marriage unshakable, and my trust in the woman I loved absolute. I met Clara when I was 28 and she was 24, a whip-smart brunette with a sharp laugh and a mind for business. We worked side by side at Redmond and Hartman, a mid-sized investment firm that her father, Gerald Hartman, co-founded years before. I used to think having family in the firm was a blessing. What I did not know was that it would become the very thing that turned my life upside down. It started small, the kind of thing most people would overlook, but I have always been meticulous. The quarterly reports Clara prepared began showing slight discrepancies, numbers that did not match the raw data in our shared system. A few $1,000s here, a missing line item there. Nothing earth-shattering at first, just enough to prick at the back of my mind. When I asked her about it, she would smile in that practiced way of hers, the one that made me feel like I was the paranoid husband who did not understand the game. "It is just carryover adjustments," she told me, brushing it off like lint from her sleeve. The words were so casual, so confident, that I almost believed her. Almost. But numbers have always been my language. I have spent my entire career in the precision of balance sheets and transaction trails. I know when they sing in harmony, and I know when they are screaming for attention. These numbers were screaming. Every instinct I had told me something was off, yet every time I pushed for more detail, Clara would twist the conversation into a joke or pivot into a story about a client's drama to distract me. She had a way of making me question myself, of making me feel guilty for even noticing. That was the first crack in the trust I thought we shared. What made it worse was the sweetness she could turn on at will. One night after I asked about a miscalculated account balance, she came home with my favorite bourbon and cooked my favorite dinner. She laughed off my concerns, kissed my forehead, and said, "Mark, you really need to relax." And for a moment I did. But later that night, lying in bed, I could not shake the thought that someone who had nothing to hide would not work so hard to make me forget my own questions. Sweetness, I was beginning to realize, can be a weapon when it is hiding the truth. I told myself I would keep my eyes open, quietly. No accusations, no big confrontations, just watching. Because if there was one thing I knew from years in finance, it was that the truth always leaves a trail. And if Clara was hiding something, I was going to find it. I did not know then just how deep that trail would go or how much damage it would reveal. But I knew one thing for certain. Numbers do not lie. People do. And the woman I loved was starting to sound less like my partner and more like a carefully constructed story I was about to unravel. It did not take long for the changes to start showing. Within a year, Clara's wardrobe had transformed completely. The woman who used to shop sales at local boutiques was now carrying shopping bags from luxury brands I had only ever seen in fashion magazines. Her closet began to look like it belonged to someone preparing for a runway show in Milan, not a mid-level executive at a family investment firm. Designer heels, tailored dresses, handbags that cost more than my first car. They were all suddenly part of her everyday look. Then came the car. One Friday afternoon, I pulled into our driveway, and there it was. A brand new Tesla gleaming in the sunlight. The kind of purchase you do not just pick up without planning. She told me it was a business perk, something the firm provided to certain staff members. I knew better. Redmond and Hartman did not give anyone a car. Her calendar began filling up with luxury weekend trips, always labeled as client networking or market research getaways. Napa Valley, Aspen, a quick trip to New York for meetings. Each time she came back with more designer luggage and stories about glamorous dinners and exclusive events. When I asked her about the costs, she would roll her eyes like I was a child, asking where the rain came from. "Mark, you worry too much. It's all reimbursed," she would say, as if that explanation alone should be enough to make me drop it. She knew I hated vague answers, and I could feel her leaning on that, using my frustration against me. I started noticing other details, new pieces of jewelry appearing without explanation, spa charges from places she had never mentioned before, receipts that were either missing or crumpled and tossed into the trash before I could see them. I made a decision. I was going to quietly save every receipt, every bank statement, every piece of paper I could get my hands on. I told myself I would not confront her until I had more than just a bad feeling. My gut had kept me alive in this industry, and it was telling me something much bigger was going on than a little overspending. The thing about Clara was that she could be incredibly charming when she wanted to be. If I even hinted that I thought she was being careless with money, she would flip the switch. A soft laugh, a hand on my arm, a reminder about how much she worked for our life. For a while, it almost worked, but charm does not erase numbers. Every receipt I tucked away, every unexplained charge I documented, made the pattern a little clearer. She was living far beyond what her salary, or mine, could justify. By the time the year ended, my file drawer at home had an entire section dedicated to Clara's spending. I did not know exactly what I was looking for yet, but I knew I would recognize it when I saw it. In my world, patterns always tell the truth, and hers was starting to scream at me. Something was wrong, and the deeper I looked, the more certain I became that it was not going to end with a shopping spree and a few fancy trips. This was the beginning of something much, much bigger. It was late, close to 11 at night, and the air outside was sharp with winter cold. I had gone for a late run to clear my head, something I had been doing more often lately. When I came back, the house was quiet, except for the faint hum of Clara's voice somewhere down the hall. I set my keys on the counter, took a drink of water, and headed toward our home office. The door was half closed, and through the narrow gap, I saw her on a video call. She did not see me standing there in the shadows, my breathing still heavy from the run. Her tone was low but certain, and then I heard the words that stopped me cold. "We will just shift the balance from the Evans account, and no one will notice." The Evans account. My chest tightened instantly. I had known Harold and Marlene Evans for years, a sweet retired couple who trusted me personally to handle their investments. They were careful with every dollar, the kind of people who called me before making any significant withdrawal, just to be safe. The idea of moving money from their account without their consent was unthinkable. It was not just unethical. It was theft. I stood there for another 30 seconds, frozen, listening as Clara nodded along to someone I could not hear, typing something on her laptop like she had done this before. When she ended the call, I stepped into the doorway, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who was that?" I asked. She spun around in her chair, her face briefly startled, before she smoothed it over with a small smile. "A tax consultant from Denver," she said, as if that explained everything. "Just some year-end adjustments. You know how messy these things can get." Her answer was too quick, too rehearsed, and she reached for her phone almost immediately, breaking eye contact. Something about the way she did it made every alarm in my head go off. I nodded like I believed her, but inside I was already turning over what I had just heard. The Evans account was not messy. It was one of the cleanest, most straightforward portfolios I managed. There was no reason for it to be touched, unless someone was moving funds for a reason they did not want documented. I kept my voice calm, asked a few casual questions, and let the conversation drift away. But the image of her on that call would not leave my mind. 2 days later, I found the sticky note she had been scribbling on during that call, tucked under a file folder on her desk. A name and a phone number. No company name, no title, just those two things. I took it, stepped outside on my lunch break, and dialed the number. A flat mechanical voice told me the number was no longer in service. I stood there in the cold, holding the phone to my ear long after the line went dead, realizing I had just heard my first undeniable proof that Clara was lying. This was no misunderstanding. Something was happening behind closed doors, and it was only a matter of time before I found out exactly what. I waited until Clara left for one of her so-called networking lunches before I sat down at my desk and logged into our shared system. She had always assumed I would never check her work because we handled different client portfolios, but we both had full administrative access. I told myself I was just going to take a quick look, maybe confirm whether my suspicions were even worth pursuing. But once I started pulling transaction logs, I could not stop. The screen filled with rows of numbers, dates, and account names I knew by heart. It did not take long before I saw the first anomaly, a $1,488 withdrawal from the Madison account, a retired teacher who never touched her investments except to take her yearly distribution. There was no corresponding note, no client request, just a silent transfer to an internal holding account. I kept scrolling. The same pattern appeared again and again. The withdrawals were always just under $20,000, spaced far enough apart to avoid triggering an automatic audit, and almost always taken from elderly clients who were unlikely to check their statements regularly. By the time I reached the end of my search, I had counted 11 accounts with unexplained withdrawals. The total hit me like a punch to the gut. Over $190,000 gone. Not missing because of a mistake. Not shuffled by accident. Gone. Every single withdrawal funneled through the same intermediary account before disappearing entirely under the label of business development expenses. That category was vague by design. It could cover anything from a legitimate marketing campaign to, apparently, whatever Clara wanted. My hands were tight on the mouse as I went back over each transaction, double-checking the dates and amounts. There was no randomness to it. She had built a system. The withdrawals were calculated, consistent, and methodical. This was not someone making sloppy errors or trying to cover a one-time oversight. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had been doing it for a while. It was like watching a magician's trick in slow motion. Now that I knew where to look, I could see the sleight of hand in every move. I remembered the Evans account, the words she had spoken that night, and it all clicked into place. She had chosen her targets carefully, picked clients who trusted the firm enough not to question minor changes, and used her position and her last name to avoid suspicion. My stomach turned at the thought of the people behind those account names, most of them living on fixed incomes, completely unaware that the person smiling at them across the desk was quietly draining their life savings. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen, my mind racing. I had spent years believing Clara was simply ambitious, driven, maybe a little too focused on image. But this was different. This was cold, deliberate theft, the kind that does not stop on its own. And as much as it made me sick to admit it, the woman I married was not just lying to me. She was robbing people who could not afford to lose a single dollar. At that moment, I knew there was no turning back. I was going to follow the trail until I reached the end, no matter where it led. I thought long and hard before bringing my findings to Gerald. He was not just my father-in-law. He was one of the founders of Redmond and Hartman, a man who had built his reputation on integrity and community trust. I walked into his office that morning with a folder so thick it barely closed. Inside were spreadsheets, bank logs, and transaction trails that told the story as clearly as any confession could. I expected him to be shocked, maybe even horrified, and I hoped deep down that he would thank me for protecting the firm's clients. I had convinced myself that once he saw the evidence, he would understand that this was not about family loyalty. It was about doing the right thing. He did not even glance at the folder when I placed it on his desk. He leaned back in his leather chair, folded his hands over his chest, and stared at me, like I was a stranger who had just walked in off the street. "You are on mandatory leave starting today," he said flatly. His voice carried no surprise, no confusion, just a hard finality that told me the decision had already been made. "I will not have you throwing mud at my daughter without proof." I blinked at him, stunned. Proof? I had spent weeks gathering it. Every number, every date, every account was documented. If that was not proof, I did not know what was. I tried to push the folder toward him, explaining that I had cross-checked the data, verified the transactions, and even found the intermediary account she was using. He would not touch it. "Mark, you are letting your marriage trouble cloud your judgment," he said, his tone dropping into that patronizing calm that people use when they want to shut a conversation down. "Clara has worked here for years, without incident. She is my daughter. That means something." I felt the weight of those words hit harder than I expected. He was telling me, without saying it directly, that no matter what I had uncovered, his loyalty would never shift away from her. I left his office feeling like the ground under my feet had given way. It was not just that Clara had betrayed me and the clients we served. Now I understood that her father would protect her, even if it meant letting the theft continue. Blood in this family was thicker than truth, thicker than ethics, thicker than the law itself. I had walked in expecting an ally and walked out knowing I was on my own. That night, Clara acted as if nothing had happened. She poured herself a glass of wine, asked about my day, and never mentioned the conversation I had with her father. But I noticed a flicker in her expression when I said I would be working from home for a while. It was the look of someone who knew they had just gained the upper hand. I went to bed with a truth that was now impossible to ignore. If I wanted justice, I would have to take it into my own hands. It had been a week since Gerald had shut me down and put me on leave, and the silence in my life felt heavier by the day. I was stuck in this limbo, unable to go back to work, unable to confront Clara without tipping my hand completely. I was beginning to wonder if I had hit a wall I could not get past when my phone rang in the middle of a cold, gray afternoon. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end was steady and direct. "Mark Reynolds, my name is David Mallory. I am a private investigator working for the firm's liability insurance. We need to talk." We arranged to meet the next morning at a quiet cafe away from downtown. David was in his mid-50s, with sharp eyes and the calm confidence of someone who had been in the game for a long time. He did not waste time with small talk. As soon as we sat down, he opened a folder and slid a few pages across the table. "Our audit flagged nearly $360,000 missing from 17 client accounts," he said. "Your wife's name is all over the movement of those funds." My stomach clenched. I had suspected the amount was bigger than what I found, but hearing the number out loud made it feel like the air had been sucked out of the room. David leaned forward, his voice low but steady. "She is not doing this alone. Based on the transaction patterns, she has help from someone inside Pacific Bank. They are bypassing the standard verification checks, making the transfers look like they are authorized. Without that insider, she could not move money this way without triggering a freeze." I felt a strange mix of validation and dread. I had been right, but the fact that there was a second player in this made it more dangerous and more complicated than I had imagined. He explained that the bank insider was likely processing fake authorization forms and pushing the transactions through during low traffic hours so they would blend in with overnight processing. "This is organized," David said. "It is not just a one-off scam. It is a system, and it has been in place for months, maybe longer. I could hear the weight in his voice, the way he measured every word, as if making sure I understood the seriousness of what we were talking about. I asked him why he was telling me all of this. He shrugged slightly and said, "Because I can tell you care about these clients, and you already know more than most people inside the firm. Gerald is protecting her. That means the official investigation is going to take longer than it should, but if you want to help me, we can make sure the truth comes out faster." Walking out of that cafe, I knew I'd just gained something I desperately needed. An ally who was not afraid of the Hartman name. For the first time in weeks, I felt like the tide had shifted. Clara might have her father on her side, but now I had someone who was willing to dig just as deep as I was. And together, we were going to find every single piece of proof she thought would stay hidden. New Year's morning should have felt like a fresh start, but that day began with a cold certainty hanging in the air. The smell of cinnamon rolls drifted from the kitchen, sweet and warm, a scent that would normally pull me into the moment. Clara was standing at the counter in her silk robe, coffee in hand, her expression perfectly calm. She turned to me with a smile that felt rehearsed, almost staged, and held out a cream-colored envelope. "This will make things easier for both of us," she said. I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out the stack of papers. Divorce documents. Everything about them was neatly prepared, signed on her end, just waiting for my signature. I looked at her, trying to read the tone in her voice, but she gave nothing away. That smile stayed fixed in place, a performance for an audience of one. In that moment, I realized exactly what this meant to her. She believed she had won. She was confident she would walk away untouched, with her father's protection and her carefully crafted image shielding her from any real consequences. These papers were not just an end to our marriage. They were her way of telling me she was already moving on, that she had no fear of anything I might do next. But what Clara did not know was that I had already prepared my own gift for the new year. In my briefcase, tucked safely in a locked compartment, was a thick folder labeled in bold black ink, "Hartman Family for immediate disclosure." Inside were copies of every piece of evidence I had gathered, transaction logs, bank statements, receipts, and David Mallory's independent audit report. The folder also contained a USB drive with a digital copy of everything, formatted and organized in a way that anyone could understand. I had been waiting for the right moment to use it, and now I knew that moment was coming sooner than she thought. I set the envelope on the counter and poured myself a cup of coffee, saying nothing about the papers. She watched me for a moment, probably expecting a reaction, maybe even a fight. But I had no intention of giving her that satisfaction. Instead, I told her I needed to stop by Gerald's annual New Year's lunch that afternoon, and that she should meet me there after she finished her errands. She agreed without hesitation, no idea what I was planning. As I walked back to my office to grab my coat and briefcase, I felt an unusual calm settle over me. For weeks, I had been collecting evidence, piece by piece, holding back my anger while she carried on like nothing was wrong. Now the clock was running out for her, and she did not even realize it. By the end of the day, the folder in my briefcase would be in Gerald's hands, in front of the entire Hartman family. And this time, there would be no dismissing it, no calling it marriage trouble, and no pretending it was anything other than the truth. Gerald's annual New Year's lunch was always the same. A long dining table in his polished oak-paneled dining room, crystal glasses catching the afternoon light, and the smell of roasted beef drifting in from the kitchen. The entire Hartman family was there, dressed in their finest, exchanging polite small talk that barely hid the undercurrent of competition that always seemed to hum beneath these gatherings. I arrived on time, folder in hand, my briefcase never leaving my side. Clara arrived a few minutes later, wearing a smile that could have graced a magazine cover. She moved from person to person, kissing cheeks, and laughing like this was just another year, and nothing had changed. I took my seat near the middle of the table, directly across from Gerald. He was in good spirits, telling stories about the firm's strong year and making a point to mention the family's role in its success. I waited until the main course had been served, until the plates were full, and the room had settled into a comfortable rhythm of conversation. That was when I stood up, the folder in my hand. The room quieted almost instantly. You could feel the shift, the way people looked up, sensing that whatever was about to happen was not part of the usual script. I walked the few steps to Gerald's side of the table and placed the folder in front of him. "You should read this before dessert," I said, my voice calm and measured. No accusation, no raised tone, just a simple instruction. He looked down at the bold black label, Hartman family, for immediate disclosure, and then up at me with a faint crease in his brow. Slowly he opened it. Inside was the printed summary of every transaction Clara had manipulated. Each page listed the account holder's name, the date of the withdrawal, the exact amount taken, and the route the money traveled before vanishing into business development expenses. The final page was a total, $359,142. Alongside the papers was a small USB drive containing the same information in digital form, along with copies of the original bank records and David Mallory's full audit report. The sound of silverware hitting plates was the only noise in the room as Gerald flipped through the pages. His face changed with each turn, the color draining slowly until his expression was a rigid mask. Clara shifted uncomfortably in her chair but said nothing. She knew better than to try to snatch the folder from his hands in front of everyone. The rest of the family sat frozen, eyes darting between Gerald and me, no one daring to speak. When he reached the last page, Gerald set the folder down and stared at it for a long moment. I stayed standing, letting the weight of the evidence settle over the room. I had not needed to shout or make threats. The truth was, sitting right there on the table, impossible to ignore, impossible to twist into something it was not. For the first time since this all began, I felt the balance shift, and I knew that whatever happened next, the Hartman family would never look at Clara the same way again. The silence in that dining room was so heavy, you could almost hear the sound of people holding their breath. Gerald kept flipping through the pages, slower now, as if he was giving himself time to process what he was reading. Clara's fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass, and then she finally spoke, her voice sharp and defensive. "This is ridiculous. You cannot believe—" She stopped mid-sentence when the dining room doors opened and David Mallory stepped inside. I had invited him for this exact moment, and the timing could not have been more perfect. He walked over to Gerald, introduced himself to the table in his calm, deliberate way, and confirmed every single detail of the evidence I had provided. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The facts spoke louder than anything Clara could say. Clara tried to cut him off, tried to accuse him of being hired to destroy her, but David was prepared. He opened his own folder, thick with documentation from the insurance company's audit, showing the same amounts, the same dates, and the same accounts I had flagged. Every document matched mine exactly. There was no escape, no way to twist this into a misunderstanding. Gerald's jaw was set, his hands gripping the folder so tightly I thought the paper might tear. I had seen him angry before, but this was different. This was the look of a man realizing his own daughter had used his name and his company to line her pockets at the expense of people who trusted them. The family lunch ended abruptly. No dessert, no polite goodbyes. Clara left in silence, her face pale, her voice gone. Gerald stayed behind in the dining room with David and me, asking questions that I knew were not really for answers, but for confirmation of what he already understood. Within weeks, the investigation expanded and the federal authorities became involved. Bank subpoenas confirmed the existence of the insider at Pacific Bank, and both of them were tied to dozens of unauthorized transactions. 3 months later, Clara was arrested. I did not attend the court hearings, but I read every line of the coverage. She eventually pled guilty to multiple counts of fraud and money laundering. The sentence was heavy, 15 years in federal prison, and the restitution order meant she would be paying back victims for the rest of her life, assuming she ever had the means to do so. Gerald, for his part, made a decision I never expected. He liquidated his stake in Redmond and Hartman, closed the firm entirely, and used a large portion of his personal savings to reimburse the clients Clara had stolen from. I will never know if he did it out of guilt, honor, or both. But I do know this. By the time spring rolled around, the Hartman name that had once been spoken with pride in Portland was now a cautionary tale. And Clara, who once thought she could control the story, was sitting in a cell with nothing left but the truth she could no longer outrun. When the divorce papers finally came back to me for signing, I felt no urge to argue, no temptation to drag the process out. I signed them with a steady hand and slid them into the return envelope without a second thought. By then, there was nothing left to salvage. The marriage had ended long before the legal process began, and the woman I had once trusted with every part of my life had proven she was capable of betraying more than just me. I did not feel relief or triumph, just a kind of quiet closure that let me take the next step without looking back. I left Portland soon after. The city felt smaller, heavier, and full of shadows that I had no interest in walking through every day. Seattle offered me something different: anonymity, a fresh start, and the kind of work that meant something beyond a paycheck. I found a role as a consultant specializing in elder financial fraud prevention. It was work that kept me close to the numbers I understood so well, but more importantly, it allowed me to protect the people who were most vulnerable to the kind of theft Clara had carried out. Every case I take on now feels like a small act of rebalancing the scale, of making sure someone else does not have to learn the same hard lesson I did. In my new life, I keep things simple. No extravagant spending, no unnecessary complications. I have an apartment overlooking the water, a small circle of friends, and work that keeps me focused. I no longer measure my success in things I can buy or places I can be seen. Instead, I measure it in the number of families I can help safeguard, the cases I can resolve, and the trust I can restore. It is a quieter life than the one I once had, but it is mine. Sometimes people ask me if I feel like I got revenge. I tell them the truth. Revenge is not always about making someone hurt the way they hurt you. Sometimes it is not loud, it is not messy, and it does not leave you feeling like you have won a war. Sometimes it is a quiet folder, handed over at the exact right moment, in front of the exact right people. It is the moment when the truth stops being something you carry alone and becomes undeniable to everyone who needs to hear it. I think back to that day in Gerald's dining room sometimes. The moment the weight shifted and the truth landed exactly where it needed to. That was enough for me. I walked away with my integrity, my work, and my future intact. And in the end, that was the only victory worth holding on to, because the best revenge is not destroying someone else. It is building a life they can no longer touch.